Hello, students. Welcome. Hello. This is the first of a series of videos that I'm hoping to put together to help you with some of the questions that you might face on your GCSE history paper. Now, this was Mr. Koromoa's idea, so I am full on stealing that. But hopefully, if you ever get stuck revising at home and you think about who or how you can potentially answer a question, maybe me going through it will help you. So let's see how well that goes. To start off with, I thought we would cover a question which I feel has a real likelihood of coming up on the paper. If I had my crystal ball and I could see into the future, see into the 4th of June, then I would potentially see this topic definitely coming up, but also potentially this question. And the question is, and I'll say this nice and clearly, so in case you need to write it down, which of the following was more important in improving the lives of African Americans? And there's a bullet point: the civil rights movement in the 1950s. The second bullet point: the civil rights movement in the 1960s. All right. So that question is worth 12 marks. You would see that at the end of the America 1920 to 1973 section. And because it's 12 marks, you'd spend 15 minutes doing that particular question. So in terms of structure, well, you've got your 2 bullet points that you definitely need to cover. If you don't cover, in this instance, the 1950s civil rights movement and the 1960s civil rights movement, you can't get above half marks. So it's really important you cover both sides. And realistically, you're looking at 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1, how did the civil rights movement in the 1950s improve the lives of African Americans? Paragraph 2, how did the civil rights movement in the 1960s improve the lives of African Americans? And paragraph 3 is a conclusion. Overall, which decade of progress had more success? Is it the 50s or the 60s? And you make a judgment. Now, if you do that really well, and that judgment ties together both those sides of both decades, the 50s and 60s, there's no reason why you can't get really good marks. So let's just go through the content and how you attack that. So first off, I'll be looking at my first paragraph at the 1950s, and I'll be saying the 1950s saw a significant success for the civil rights movement as. And what I'll be looking for here is an explanation of the successes the civil rights movement had, focusing on one of 3 events: either Brown versus Topeka, the Montgomery bus boycott, or Little Rock 1957. So Brown versus Topeka would be a good argument to start off with, and the reasons why you could say that was so successful in improving the lives of African Americans was because through Linda Brown putting a case forward that she shouldn't walk 21 blocks to an all-black school, but walk 7 blocks to a white school, and the NAACP under Thurgood Marshall putting her case forward first to the district court, which it didn't work. They said that separate but equal, which was the segregation law, was fine. But then the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. Now that's important because it was the first time that the Supreme Court had acted in support of the civil rights movement. And in my keyword that my class always say to it, set a precedent for later actions by the Supreme Court. It also raised the confidence of the civil rights movement. It also raised the issue. If you're talking about the bus boycott, obviously you're going to be describing about Rosa Parks and saying how she was selected by the NAACP to put forward a case that she should not be prosecuted for not giving up her seat to a white man. But you also want to be explaining why that's important. Well, it's important for 3 reasons, really. The first reason is that it highlighted and revealed the economic power of the black community, because they were able to force the bus company to change their laws. The second reason was it led to bus travel, or segregated bus travel, being ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1956. And the third reason is that it led to the emergence of Martin Luther King as a civil rights leader, as he helped organise the boycott. that's a nice strong point to go with. Now, Little Rock, if you're focusing on that, what you could do is you could tie Little Rock and Brown versus Topeka together. Because essentially Little Rock, the NAACP sent 9 students into Little Rock High School in order to test the ruling of Brown versus Topeka. Because really schools weren't desegregating. So they needed to put a test to it and see if that was actually what would happen if they sent black students to an all-white school. Now, your arguments about why that improved the lives of African Americans is fundamentally around the fact that Eisenhower got involved. Because of the angry white mobs that were in place when the black students tried to go to Little Rock High School, and the violence that occurred, and the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, refusing to let the students go into the school, Eisenhower had to act because of international pressure that the media attention was creating. So he sent in the paratroopers in order to protect the students. And this is this really significant point because it was the first time that a president had acted in support of the civil rights movement. And as my word again, it set a precedent for future actions of presidents. So you can have a really good analysis, a really good bit of meat at the end of that paragraph saying that the Little Rock Nine and the actions of Eisenhower set a precedent for what would happen in the 1960s. This is why it improved the lives of the African Americans. So, what are those 3 topics you're going to cover in that first paragraph? Brown versus Topeka, Little Rock Nine, or bus boycott? A good answer could merge all 3. But remember, you've only probably got about 6 minutes to write this paragraph out. So don't spend too long writing out a massive paragraph in the 50s, not giving yourself enough time for the 60s paragraph. Right, moving on now to looking at the 1960s. And really what you want to be talking about here are the sit-ins. You could be talking about the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, or talking about mass support movements such as the March on Washington or the Selma March. You could also mention the Freedom Rides in there, which happened in 1960. So if I was talking about the sit-ins and the Freedom Rides, well, the sit-ins were where 4 students went to a branch of Woolworths in Greensboro, Alabama, and sat in a whites-only counter. This led to a larger protest of 400 students joining in. And the key thing with that is it revealed that the civil rights movement went beyond Martin Luther King. And actually, it inspired other movements. It showed that students were willing to act. Now, the Freedom Rides revealed the racist nature of America, and especially in the South, since the police chief, Bull Connor, had given the police the day off, whilst these bus groups of white and black students, white-black people, not necessarily students, were travelling across the country, testing out whether desegregation was happening. They were going into toilets, and white people were using black facilities, black people were using white facilities, and they were just really seeing what would happen. And what happened was violence, and that's almost what they wanted. They wanted to get a confrontation, they wanted to get a reaction. And this served the purpose of raising the awareness of racism in America, and it also, importantly with the Freedom Rides, it led to the involvement of Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, who said that no further challenges to desegregation would be allowed. But importantly, both those events, the sit-ins and the Freedom Rides, revealed that actually the civil rights movement was wider than Martin Luther King. Interestingly enough, though, you could use both of those as an argument as to why Martin Luther King was influential, because that he inspired both of those movements. But just don't confuse the fact, or don't start saying that Martin Luther King was behind either the sit-ins or the Freedom Rides, because he wasn't directly involved. What he was directly involved in, though, is the next thing you could talk about, which is the March on Washington. And the March on Washington was where 250,000 people went to Washington to campaign for improved civil rights and equality for black people. Now, this is important because what it leads to directly is it leads to, firstly, the I Have a Dream speech, which is an inspirational speech, and it led to Martin Luther King getting further followers. It also led to JFK agreeing or deciding to put the Civil Rights Bill in place in order to allow equality for African Americans. And the third thing that it allowed to do is it showed that African Americans had the support of white people. There's 80,000 people on that march were white. And it showed that America as a group was supporting the civil rights movement. The acts themselves, so the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, are important because they showed that the law is changing and banning segregation, which is the Civil Rights Act did. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act stopped any voting restrictions to black people. And that was as a response to the March on Selma, which Johnson was forced to basically put through the Voting Rights Act because of the violence that was revealed following this march, to campaign for voting restrictions to be removed. Again, that's evidence that MLK was important because MLK helped organise Selma, deliberately chose Selma, the town of Selma, because only 3% of the population in Selma were registered to vote, and that needed to change. Common thread about all through Martin Luther King's marches and actions is that he chooses places to act where he knows is going to be a response, and that's a really key point. Right, so I'll be explaining, maybe picking one or two of those topics to explain why the 60s were important, but the key thing is you don't get the 50s and the 60s confused. 50s, Brown versus Topeka, bus boycott, Little Rock. 60s, sit-ins and freedom rides, marches, so March on Washington, March on Selma, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. Make sure you have those distinctions in your mind really clearly. Then in the final bit of conclusion, probably about 3 minutes you're going to spend writing on this. What you should be doing is linking the two together. So what I might say is that if I'm saying the 50s was more important, I say the 50s is more important for improving the lives of African Americans as the actions in the 50s, such as Brown versus Topeka and the bus boycott, paved the way for the actions that later happened in the 60s. For example, if during the bus boycott Martin Luther King hadn't emerged as a leader, it's possible that the Civil Rights Bill, or later the Act, would never have happened. Equally, you could say that the 60s were important because, in fact, the changes that happened in the 50s were very limited. Things like the Brown versus Topeka ruling, where they desegregated schools, actually only changed the law. Schools, in fact, weren't desegregated. By 1964, only 3% of schools were desegregated. So you could explain that the 60s were more important because that banned all segregation, not just in limited areas, whether it's education or transport. Now, they're just two of the conclusions you can draw. There's lots more. The key thing with this question, if you want to get a beyond 9 marks, is having that killer conclusion where you're linking those 2 points together. Right, that's it for this question. I hope you found this useful. I'm going to try and do a few more of these videos as we go through. As I've said, I've just stolen Mr. Cormo's idea, so thank you, Mr. Cormo. And I hopefully think that this will have some use. Bye.